Community Currency with Carol Bruyere, Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
I feel this feeling in my heart. I know she knows.
Hello, welcome back to Community Currency, and I'm very happy to say that we finally have David E. Martin on the line, and I'm so glad because I really want to pick up the conversation where we left off last week when we were cut off suddenly by the power outage, which was not the CIA's fault. But you were talking at the time, David, as you recall, about one reason that you wrote the novel, and that was to prevent an erasure of some really critical financial records. And I'd like to go back to your personal story, how you got involved with this plot, and how at the initial meeting you were asked to participate and you declined. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your actual experience then?
Sure. It is always fascinating when people are encountering an interaction with the brushes that various people have in various times in their life with the perception of or the actuality of power. And interesting for my experience, at least, I had been, due to the nature of the work that I do, very frequently involved with situations where people of great consequence were gathering and seeking the input that we brought to bear on a number of settings, and that came from historical work that we did with several governments, probably most notably several governments in Asia, as well as some of the European and Eastern Bloc countries, where we did an enormous amount of work in the early 90s, working with them on treaty-restricted technologies, where we were helping to bring civilian applications to bear on technologies that have been developed for military applications. And because of that background, the idea of being in the room with powerful people was something that was far from an anomaly. So that the specifics of that meeting, when we got together the first time in New York, was fascinating in that I think the expectation, because as you gather in the book, the shareholders are all relatively along in years, not old, but certainly, later in their careers. I think there was an assumption that somehow or another being in the presence of people with a great deal of resource and reach and power would somehow be disarming at a certain level. And I think the biggest disappointment out of the gate was that there are an awful lot of people who in that room were very used to people of my age, kind of falling all over themselves to get next to these individuals. And I did not have that response when I met them. I mean, I try to honor every human being, and I try to honor the value that each person brings to the world. But titles have never impressed me very much, and titles where they're associated with having hoarded a significant amount of resources, whatever those are, also don't impress me much. And I'm very interested in people for the sake of people. So at that meeting, I think the desire was that somehow or another being next to influential people was going to somehow soften me up, and that really didn't happen. And the proposition, and more importantly, the ludicrous nature of the proposition, which, as I said in our first conversation, is not a huge reach. I mean, for years, offices of power in the United States, and for that matter, most of the rest of the world, have been for sale to very significant financial interests. So the notion that somebody would transact something as audacious as buying a presidential election doesn't sound audacious at all if anybody looks at history. But the notion that it would be as calculated, the fact that there would be careful market research done, finding the candidate who would be most appealing to the majority of the electorate and finding the right person to run against them, and essentially the degree of detail, which had gone from just cocktail party musings down into very specific, who were the marketing firms that would be hired, what types of marketing messages would be looked for, how would we make sure that both sides of the ticket were covered, all of those variables and the detail into which there had been methodical planning was something that, first of all, was at the first presentation quite fascinating that this had been really thought out, and then quite chilling that the individuals in question were more than happy to see this kind of situation unfold. And I think that, as I said in our first conversation, the desire was that my access to a lot of places around the world and my access to the ability to understand very large amounts of unstructured data for the purpose of detecting asset transfers and other things became the shiny object, if you will, that most of the shareholders were hoping to have on side with them. And once again, we have had countless opportunities where both private sector and public sector interests have tried to take the technology that we use and apply it for all sorts of reasons, some pure greed, some pure nefarious behavior, and some just people who want their hands on really cool technology. And I have always felt that the technology that I helped bring into being was here to better a bigger picture of humanity than the self-interest of a few. So saying no is actually something I've gotten quite used to, and this was neither the first nor the last time that I had that opportunity.
Well, in your novel, you tell them that it's a reckless plan and that it's a pathetic fantasy by lying to hundreds of millions of people and preying on their stupidity and trust, or both, and you condemn them and walk out the door, and they sort of threaten you. But
yep.
You did say that. You did say something along those veins, and you did try to walk out the door at that early meeting. Is that
Not
correct?
only tried to walk out the door, I did walk out the door and walked past the car that had been arranged to transport me, and I got in a cab like I have in the novel and left on my own and paid my own way out.
Mm-hmm.
I had a similar experience, Carol, a few years later, actually, that took place with a group of attorneys who were worried that some of the fraudulent innovation transactions in the form of patents that we were starting to uncover, they were afraid for their corporate liability and hosted a meeting out in Cincinnati that had an awful lot of look and feel to the meeting I describe in the book, and had a very similar outcome. I was asked to come out and be their guest, and I wound up flying myself home because it was a situation where I didn't want to have anything to do with any part of their resource, including the hospitality they extended in the trip.
Well, in your novel too, there are times when beautiful, gorgeous women try to seduce you, who you suspect are CIA operatives, and it also sounds like you're actually abducted and tortured for a few days, and don't really want to talk about it with your wife or your family, and it disturbs you greatly. Now, did the Enterprise, do you feel, have a hand in the attempted seduction attempts, and those did happen then? And were you tortured or interrogated to a degree which could be considered tortured by this group?
You know, that's a question, as I've shared with you before, Carol. I have had a very interesting opportunity to reflect on the events of the period from 2004 to 2006, which is the period to which you're referring. Mm-hmm. There were a number throughout that period, a number of times where there were actual and threatened actions that were done to me. Mm-hmm. There were actual and threatened detentions. There were a number of things that I believe would be considered, and in fact in one particular rather interesting moment. One of the arms of the U.S. law enforcement intelligence apparatus expressed extreme frustration with the fact that they have tried every technique they have. It was her words, and for some reason they can't seem to figure out what incentive they can offer that would allow me to see a cooperation path with them as something I would be willing to take. And what was fascinating was in the conversation they had talked about the fact that they had tried both the positives of money and women and power and fame, and they'd also tried physical damage. They had tried all of these things, and they couldn't figure out what would trigger a response that would get me to change the path that I'm on. And Colleen, my wonderful wife, had the pleasure of being in one of those conversations, and she looked at the person who was telling us this, and she said, "Oh, they should have asked me. He's been clueless his whole life, and he could be hit on by anybody, and he wouldn't know it." And it was actually a very playful moment. I don't use the word torture for an important reason.
Okay.
Torture has become a very charged word.
Okay.
I have had physical and psychological deprivation and physical and psychological interventions, if you will. Some people might call it that. I call it something very different, because what I think is the real value of having been through the experience that I was given the opportunity to experience is that I understand the cost of compromise at its extreme. And that's really the way I see it. The way I see it is that whether it is detentions, whether it is physical stresses, all of which have been part of my life, I have to see them not for the cruelty of the inhumanity between human beings, but I see it as an opportunity to look at those moments and be reminded constantly, and actually literally bear in my body the ability to be reminded of the cost of compromise. And I think that if we as a humanity are going to choose a different pathway, it will take some people who have been through very difficult times being able to sit in a room of people who are armchair philosophizing about the merits of holding a path of integrity or not. It will take people who have been through difficult situations and challenging stresses, who go, you know what, I've lived the cost of that compromise, and it's not worth making. Because I think most compromises that have degraded the humanity that we experience now were probably thought to be relatively innocent in their first instance. And then gradually they get worse and worse and worse until at one point the inhumanity kicks in, and we all sit back and say, how on earth did we get here? But the answer is we gradually gave ourselves up to that outcome. And so having the experience that I've had, I don't count it as torture, and I don't count it as anything other than the opportunity to learn very directly and very physically the path that is the natural end of what appears to be expediency and compromise in the moment. Okay. And that's part of the reason why I am to what I'm doing now. Okay.
And so that's a great insight, and I appreciate you sharing that, and sort of your humanity too, in looking at these people who think they have power but are manipulated. Even I think you even have. Although I don't have almost any sympathy for Dick Cheney, it sounds to me like, while some of us just classify him as evil, Cheney might not have had all the whole picture either. He might also have been a piece in a larger game unwittingly, even if he did some things that were just, evil and terrible and wrong, in normal person's view of reality, that even he wasn't the total mastermind behind 9/11 and all the other crimes that took place. Is that correct?
I am less willing to grant Cheney as broad a birth of forgiveness as I might grant a lot of other people. There is no question that he was directly involved in a number of activities which at their core both violated the laws of the United States as well as, generally accepted principles of humanity. And people who make that choice, whether they are actors for a third party or whether they themselves are the mastermind, I don't have an enormous amount of room for the "I was forced to do it" argument. That said, I find very little attractive in the Occidental impulse to find good guys and bad guys and ascribe blame and guilt, because what has happened in those situations where we identify who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, I think we cheapen the human experience down to a serious.
David?
Limited.
Oh, I'm sorry, I lost you there for a minute. I don't know.
I was just saying that I think that when we get too caught up in good guys and bad guys, I think the Occidental impulse, which is framed out of a fairly significant religious influence to find the judgment of good and bad to be something that we should spend time on. What I think we miss is the fact that in that judgment we lose the opportunity both to understand the humanity of people that are in those situations, but more importantly, while we're focusing on ascribing blame, we let happen around us far more injustice. And so I'd rather be focusing on the system level issues which allow us to change the operating ecosystem rather than trying to figure out whether Dick Cheney at the end of the day was good or bad. I will tell you, without question, that the Greek Olympic security scenario that's laid out in the book,
right,
and the actors in that book, and the actors that are described in much greater detail than a lot of the more anonymized names, those things happened at the vice president's residence. And I have both direct experience as well as third-party direct experience of the nature of those transactions that ultimately led to the paying to arm the enemies of the United States or alleged enemies of the United States, that ultimately were funds that were deployed to create those military and conflict regions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and for that matter in the Gaza Strip, that led the Bush administration to its ease of expanding the war effort. And there is no question that U.S. dollars and there is no question that U.S. Hardware and military technology were used on both sides of the conflict. And so a lot of the men and women who lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan did not do so because somehow or another the Iraqis and the Afghanis had access to, Russian or Korean or Iranian technology. There is a significant amount of the casualty of the armed forces of the United States that came from munitions purchased by funds transferred around the Olympic security. And that indeed was a vice president residence plan.
All right. And in the book, sometimes you play God and you have this sort of heaven's view of the characters who you've met plotting this, plotting that, and seeing things like testing technologies. There's one incident where a plane goes down and one of the shareholders and his family are lost, and it's just, a technical mistake. And now all of these incidents are these things that you've found out from your intelligence network, or that you have firsthand knowledge of?
Well, there's a particular passage in the book where I describe an episode in Turkey, which is probably the best way to answer this. It was the second payment of cash for the Olympic security overpayment by a number of U.S. contractors who were essentially the funnel through which money passed to people who are arming our enemies. Mm-hmm. And in that particular situation, the fascinating series of events which led to a shootout on a bridge in Istanbul, mm-hmm. That series of events, as it played out, and the actors at play are in fact all real human beings, real people that I knew and met. And the person who was actually killed in that episode is a person who I had spent considerable time with just a few weeks earlier. It was his at the time girlfriend who reported to me the actual events. So the events are both a composite of a personal friendship with an individual who lost his life, mm-hmm. as well as events reported by people who were at the scene. But that series of events is an opportunity where, you know, the guy who was actually dropping the money and who died is a person, I would not characterize him as a friend, but an acquaintance. I knew who he was. Mm-hmm. And the events, as I lay them out in the book, are the events that happened.
Okay. And in regards to the planting of explosives in the World Trade Center complexes, you refer to a specific time and date. Now, what about that information? Where did you get that piece of knowledge?
Well, that information comes from a series of dry shipping records are among the things that we collect, where there was a series of shipments of explosives which were supposed to be mining explosives but had the ability to be effective on structural steel. Mm-hmm. That series of shipments was a series of shipments that had a very mysterious origination point, because there was no munitions capacity at that point. And the destination of those shipments also had a quite bizarre destination, both of which, when you looked at both the source and the destination, we knew that there was, in all likelihood, a documentation cover-up, because neither the source nor the port of entry would have been a place where that type of explosive would have been shipped. So the ability to peg the time of the shipments was an ability that comes from shipping records. Okay. The ability to extrapolate that the cargo was in fact that cargo is extrapolation.
Okay. Well, in the meeting, the first meeting, it seems like they mention a biological attack. They don't mention the destruction of the World Trade Center specifically. And in the novel, you also describe they gleefully saying that the buildings can be hit by drones, and the people who are flying the drones wouldn't even know that they were flying drones into targets. Now, is that an extrapolation? Where did you get that little tidbit?
Well, the biologic issue goes back into the mid-'90s when I became aware of what was happening through a number of U.S. labs that became what appeared, from our perspective, to be violations of the Geneva Convention on Biologic and Chemical Warfare Agents. That's something that we've tracked, and not only have we tracked, but we have a global technology assessment, which is something that our company does, that the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, for a permanent record of the individual state-sponsored violations of the Geneva Conventions. That information is information that we collected firsthand. And in fact, I was physically on the ground at a number of the anthrax labs where various anthrax activities have been undertaken, including the propagation of anthrax vaccines, which is something that has been a joint collaborative effort between a number of countries for quite some time now, as well as the aerosolization of anthrax, which is a less redemptive proposition and is explicitly a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Those are things that we have direct firsthand and on the ground, like literally have been in labs where this is going on.
Okay.
With respect to the first part, which has to do with the explosion, the explosives, the very clear run up to the 9/11 event, the actual remote flight operations.
Oops, we're losing you again, David. Are you there?
Do you have me now?
I have you now, but your voice cut out. So can you say what you said? Uh-oh.
Yeah. I'm here.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, I hear your voice. Can you try again?
Yes. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I hear you well now.
Okay.
Now I don't hear you.
Flight operations.
Arrgh. That's the problem with technology. It fails you when you need it most.
Well, not moving.
Yeah. Okay. And
Do you have me now?
I do have you now.
Okay, let's try one more time. With respect to the flight operations and the remote control of flight operations, that is technology that we have been documenting, and we have been interacting with the individuals who have sourced that technology for years.
Uh-huh.
That is not a unique and new thing. That's been around for a long time. The fact of the tests is also something that we are directly aware of. The fact of the test with respect to a series of accidents that were booked as pilot error running up to 9/11 is something where we have gone back and looked at the aircraft service records in certain instances when that has been available. Mm-hmm. And we have found an alarming correlation between system tests of flight simulators and pilot error rendered crashes around the world. And so we have built the thesis that system test was in preparation for remote operations, but that's something which is, once again, our conjecture driven off of the data we have primary source confirmation around.
Okay. All right. So I just was wondering about you're mentioning how the operators could also pay off the insurance companies so that they covered things up, and
that's happened many times.
And yeah, I think that's one of the biggest sort of smoking guns that you've pointed out to us too, is that when those buildings were destroyed, the insurance companies did not do an investigation, that there was no real investigation into the destruction of the buildings. They just paid out the $7 billion.
Well, bear in mind that there is the midnight transition of the insurance, property casualty insurance coverage, midnight on September the 10th, and at 12:01 a.m. on September the 11th, the policy that had been held by Lloyd's of London members for years became the crowd policy for AIG and affiliated companies. So literally the morning of the event, the policy shifted. Mm-hmm. Now that is something which is just flat out beyond the pale. And the fact that the federal government, several years later, when faced with the possible collapse of AIG and the ultimate bankruptcy of AIG, the federal government not only paid out AIG's obligation, but monetized credit default swaps and other non-cash obligations which traded at a discount, denominated those dollar for dollar on their notional value to interest holders in AIG, is beyond something that should have been passively ignored by the rest of us, because we should have been looking at that saying, well, hold on a second, how does something that trades at 70 or 80 cents on the dollar, or something that trades at 10 cents on the dollar, get paid out at its notional dollar value using intervention bailout money? How did that happen? And why would it be so important to monetize over the actual notional obligation cost? How could it be that what you were doing was trying to make sure AIG was somehow beyond the reach of any investigation of any person? With the federal government owning AIG, it becomes a very easy process to go in and confirm that those records are managed appropriately, and by managed appropriately, I mean taken out of circulation.
And okay, and I guess one of the questions that I can't help raising is there's no possibility of any actual accountability in any courts of law that you know of where, hard information pointing to gross international crimes could be addressed. That's not.
Well, Carol, you and I both lament the fact that when law enforcement has been privatized effectively through what we call Homeland Security, where there is no line between the judiciary and the executive, it is very, very difficult with the erasure of that line to find any jurisdiction that will support an inquiry, much less a finding of fact and ultimately finding of guilt. Because right now, the very entities and organizations which would be charged with doing such a thing are precluded from doing so for two reasons. One being that the independence of the judiciary has long been compromised, and second being that the law enforcement itself was, in many respects, read into a lot of the acts which would require investigation. Now, there is a period of time that is coming, not yet upon us, but there is likely a period of time when a sufficient number of then law enforcement and then intelligence agency folks start retiring, that I think you'll see a number of them start to informally socialize what they knew, who they were doing things with, and so forth, because there are just so many people that were caught up in it. But the penalty, if they were to come out with the stories or inform, is so ridiculously punitive that it would really be something that would take a level of courage that I have not seen in many people. So the degree to which I think it's likely that we'll have the information come out is fairly low, but it certainly doesn't have a short duration in terms of the fuse before it happens. It would take a significant event.
Yeah, well, in your novel, the shareholders themselves, they come from many different countries.
That's correct.
Okay, so, and it seems that the whole thing was orchestrated through a U.S. intelligence agency, but it included intelligence agencies from a number of different countries. Is that or
if you go back and try to understand the intelligence web around the world, it's important to go back to the Second World War and realize that the intelligence agencies of the Second World War are the intelligence agency networks that start. But really, the U.S. intelligence apparatus is, relatively speaking, a fairly new enterprise. We did not have the level of sophistication during the Second World War, for example, that existed at the beginning of the war with entities like Bletchley Park in the UK. There is no accident, for example, that a number of the Pacific sources of intelligence were through the U.S. Department of Navy in partnership with the Australian government.
So the question
and the
is,
U.S. was very active. And so we've never had, and this is another one of those interesting puzzles, we've never had an intelligence monopoly, even in the height of the Cold War, as much as we like to think of the movies and the various novels that we've represented, we've had, because there are a lot of places where we just don't have the access that would be needed to do that. And so we've always had a network around the world of people who have agreed to at various times be allies and various times be enemies.
And it is like a chess game. Nobody knows who's who's in control, and maybe nobody's in control. There's shifting alliances within the.
Well, I think what you're seeing. Yeah, I think what you're seeing in the recent.
Whoops, we're losing you, David.
You're seeing in the last few years, and more reasonably, what you're seeing even in the last few months, is the recognition that the alliance between Pakistan and China has grown to be the great destabilizer that I forecast actually in the book and in the novel. Interestingly enough, if a person looks at the cover of the novel, they see that the last flag to fall is the Pakistani flag, and it is displacing the British flag for a very good reason. Because when we have the Pakistani, Iranian, and Chinese alliance all in position, the intelligence capacity of those three countries, and more importantly, the corporate intelligence, specifically of the Chinese and the Pakistanis, is something that will, for the first time in certainly modern memory, give a real run for the intelligence dollars of the incumbency of the UK and the US.
Mm-hmm. And right now there is you have in the novel the murders of some of the top intelligence agencies who are advising the director of the CIA, and the fact that the last phases of the plan aren't known to all the shareholders, but not everybody's at the table anymore.
That is correct, and that's actually the way it is in reality. There was a concern among some of the shareholders that the reach beyond the original plan, which was essentially to pass a phenomenal amount of wealth from the public sector to the private sector, that reach was one reach too far, where you could make a lot of money and you could get away with a lot of things, and your corporations could essentially be the conduit to move significant public wealth into private accounts. That was
oh, we're losing you, David, again. I'm sorry. I guess we've lost David. I'm going to just have to encourage folks to read his novel, check out his blog, and check out his work. Check out the Global Innovation Commons, and I hope that next time I have him on the show, which I hope will be again, we'll have him on a landline in the United States, and it won't be quite as problematic as catching him in Mexico. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. Thank you to our brave technicians at PRN, and to Rebecca Cross for our beautiful theme music. And I wish you all the best, and I hope that this Bill of Rights Day, you will do something to defend our Bill of Rights as the onslaught against American civil liberties is taking place. Thank you again. Bye-bye.